This is Dr. Umesh Gidwani, Director of the Cardiac ICU. This is normally a cardiac unit, and I want to show you how we've changed this unit to take care of our COVID patients. So to finish our complete PPE, we're going to wear this N95 mask. And then if we are going to enter the patient room, we're going to wear a face shield, an impermeable gown, and gloves as well. Okay, now we're going to walk around the unit to see the work of the day as the people toil in the front lines. This is our ICU. Everyone is pitching in. We have here Dr. Matteo, who is a cardiac intensivist, Dr. Pradhan, who is a critical care fellow. Here we have Dr. Matt Levin. Dr. Levin has been instrumental in leading the effort to devise the tubing so that we can split a ventilator to be able to serve two patients. It's a fairly complex design.
We're taking what we've seen many people do online and adding what we think is the most important element, which is valves to control the flow and let you titrate what's delivered to the patient, and one-way valves to prevent backflow to actually do it. So we've been testing it in our anesthesia simulation lab on two high-fidelity human patient simulators, both connected to a single ventilator. It works extremely well.
They're getting ready to do a tracheostomy on a patient. They're using PPEs called PAPRs because they're going to do this surgical procedure, and it's going to be done at the bedside.
We were able to transfer a patient off the unit. It's the first patient that I've been directly helping take care of, who we successfully extubated and who was able to go to a step-down unit. So I found that very encouraging. Even though the patient, had some comorbidities, they were able to, successfully come off the vent.
The day is coming to an end. At least the 12-hour shift of the day shift is coming to an end. Soon I'm going to change back into my street clothes, take off my hat and mask and scrubs, put them in the hospital laundry, and have a quick shower, hopefully scrub the coronavirus off my body, if not of my soul, and sit down with the family for dinner. Thank you.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.